I'm Kenny Donaldson and I'm Director of SAFE, Supporting, Empowering, Fair and Focused. SAFE was formed in 1998 to provide services and supports for the innocent victims and survivors of terrorism and other troubles-related criminal violence. And over the years, SAFE has grown very much from a local initiative within a small part of Rwanda to be not only a regional organisation, but also national and indeed international. And it's in more recent years where the organisation has developed linkages with groupings and communities across Africa, the United States and mainland Europe.
Rwanda was separated from Burundi and gained independence on the 1st of July 1962, which is commemorated as Independence Day, a national holiday. Cycles of violence followed, with exiled Tutsi attacking from neighbouring countries, and the Hutu retaliating with large-scale slaughter and repression of the Tutsi. In 1994, Rwanda's population of 7 million was composed of three ethnic groups: the Hutu, who accounted for approximately 85%, the Tutsi with 14%, and the Twa 1%. The population of Rwanda today stands at 13.8 million people. Beginning in 1984 and lasting only 100 days, the Rwandan genocide is one of the most notorious modern genocides. During this 100-day period between April and July 1984, nearly 1 million ethnic Tutsi and moderate Hutu were killed as the international community and UN peacekeepers stood by. To understand how such a tragic event could happen, the Rwandan genocide must first be seen as the product of Belgian colonialism. It was during colonial rule that Rwanda's ethnic groups, Hutu, Tutsi and Twa, became racialised. It was the rigidification of these identities and their relationship with political power that would lay the foundation for genocidal violence. When Rwanda gained independence in 1962, the ethnic majority Hutus were left in power. Hutu rule resulted in widespread discrimination against Tutsi, laying the groundwork for the 1994 genocide. Additionally, the Rwandan genocide must also be understood as taking place within the context of a civil war. Before the genocide began, a civil war began between the government's armed forces and the rebel Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, led by Tutsi exiles in Uganda, which broke out in 1990. The context of an ongoing war led to anti-Tutsi propaganda, painting Tutsis as dangerous traitors. In 1994, when the Rwandan president, Juvenal Habyarimana's plane was shot down, the genocide began, in which 800,000 Tutsi and many moderate Hutus were massacred. Today, Rwanda continues to face challenges as a nation and stands accused of human rights violations from some within the international community. However, there's also been a period of relative stability for the best part of 3 decades. The nation has sought to unify around the core overarching commonality of the people, that all who reside within that land space, first and second, all are viewed as Rwandan.
And a small number of years ago, by chance, we were introduced to a lady from Thrive Ireland, which exists under the parameters of the Presbyterian Church. And at that point, we didn't quite know what was going to happen. But we were forever set on a path which would mean us ending up on the hills and the streets and the dirt tracks of Rwanda. Now, what was our experience or knowledge of Rwanda? Limited, it has to be said. But as an organisation, we of course had empathy with the realities of almost 1 million people being slaughtered in a genocide, the Hutus upon the Tutsis within that small nation. That of course represents 1 in 8 of the population of Rwanda, wiped out. And all of this within a period of 3 small months. That country and nation was on its knees, and in many ways had nowhere else to fall. And thankfully, that nation decided to get onto its knees and to slowly build itself up. So we put plans afoot and organised a number of liaison meetings with Thrive Ireland, but also an organisation called Karsa Ministries based in Rwanda. And its CEO, Christophe Nyongabo, was someone whom we had an automatic connection with. And it was only a small, short 2 years afterwards that we then actually placed our feet on the soil of Rwanda. We spent almost 2 weeks in the nation. And it's a part of my life that I will never ever forget. The one and truly only time when I feel a full sense of inner peace. The beauty of that nation, the beauty of the people, was quite awe-inspiring, set against the backdrop that only 30 years previous, that genocide was carried out. If we were to take those figures to the Northern Ireland context of a population of 2 million, it would have meant that 250,000, 250,000 of our citizens would have been murdered or killed over the course of the Troubles, and not the 3,700 odd that actually was in reality. That experience saw us engage with people where they were at. There was nothing artificial or manipulated about our visit. We met with clergy. We met with public policy makers. We met with a whole range of people who are making a difference across Rwandan society. But most importantly, we met with the victims of that genocide. And we also had occasion on a couple of the days whilst there to meet with perpetrators of the genocide. For they, along with their victims, were part of what was known as cell groups, predominantly based within the mountains. And these cell groups were groupings of people who had come back together again, where there was forgiveness and genuine reconciliation between them. And many will ask, how on earth would that be possible against the backdrop of the evil that was committed within that country? And the truth is that the perpetrators owned what they did. They accounted for it, and there was no prevarication. There were no excuses. There was no mealy-mouthed reasons why they did what they did. Many used the following words: we were possessed by the devil, and we rolled out a form of propaganda upon our neighbours, which essentially darkened our souls. So against that backdrop in that place, we watched as victims and perpetrators interacted. When perpetrators shared their experiences, the pain was etched across their faces as they relived what they had done.
So church leaders who were involved in the genocide faced the justice. They had to go to the court. Some are still in the prison today. So after genocide, those church leaders who were not involved in the genocide, they're the ones who contribute their services. But those church leaders who were involved in genocide were also faced justice and were in the court.
And on many occasions, it was the victims who actually brought solace and comfort to those individuals by holding their hands, by putting an arm around their shoulder. Why were they able to do that? Because they were filled with grace. It was Christianity, the most purest form of it, in action. And it was demonstrable that you could see that connection that was coming again between neighbours who had become so estranged. Over the course of the week, we made many visits across Rwanda. And one of the most poignant was a visit to Nyamata. This was a church where a number of members of the clergy had been responsible for summoning some 5,000 strong Tutsis to that location supposedly to give them a form of sanctuary and comfort from the mobs who were seeking to remove their lives. Those same clergy then departed from that place. They had set up those people, and 5,000 were slaughtered. To even visualize that amount of death within such a short and condensed space is something that will live with me forever. And within that church, the clothing that the people wore was still there. It was like a lasting testimony to what had happened. And the clothes of children, aged some of them 2 and 3 years of age. There were very few bullets used in Rwanda, or bombs. All the roughest form of equipment that was used to murder. Garden-based, I suppose, utensils you would say here, what would be used for labouring in the field. Stones, the most basic of weapons, but they were used to maximum effect. Another occasion which really got to all of us through the enormity of it was our visit to the National Genocide Memorial in Kigali. And there, 250,000 people had their remains laid to rest in that space. And to see how they have acknowledged the totality of that genocide, how the history has been written and is not allowed to be rewritten. Those who would deny the genocide or in any way seek to diminish its effects will still face the full rigours of the law in that space. Something else that really struck me personally as well, as someone who loves animals, that in the aftermath of that genocide, because of the death and because of human carcasses literally lying on roads and streets, the dogs became wild. And all dogs in Rwanda had to be shot. They were without dogs for some time because of the gravity of what had happened. And then I want to speak to an occasion where I've never felt more uplifted in life. The term martyr, hero, courage is thrown around way too easily in this world. And we know that in this space of Northern Ireland, terrorists use that language to try and suggest that those who went out to murder their neighbour are all of those things. We know not to be the case. But in Rwanda, we visit a school situated on a mountain top. And within that school were a group of young people there to study and to form their education. And from across the mountains of DR Congo one night came a group of Hutu rebels. This was 3 years after the genocide had finished. And in they came and they demanded that the young people divide between Hutu and Tutsi. This, let's remember us, is a follow-on from colonialism, the introduction of that identity card, dividing people in that artificial way. And the kids remained silent when challenged. Twice more they were challenged to divide. And then one of the killers cocked his rifle and said it one more time. And a young man stood forward and he said the following: "We are not Hutu and Tutsi, we are Rwandan." A burst of fire followed, and he, along with 4 of his friends and fellow pupils, were slain, were shot dead. The message of that young man is this: he would prefer to die in unity with his fellow Rwandans than to live in an artificially constructed society. And that, to me, is something that I have never saw any other example of this. That's true courage. That's being a true martyr. That's living out God's word. And it was special to hear that story relayed. Across the rest of our time in Rwanda, we had a great deal of prayer amongst us as a group, because I was privileged to be joined by 5 special individuals who themselves have all been bereaved as a result of the terrorist campaign. And one particular lady who had been bereaved only a little over a decade prior to this time. And those individuals uplifted me, and I hope my presence also helped them. But in terms of what those folks would say they got from the experience, I think first and foremost is validation. It's a validation that what they have believed is the truth. That all violence is wrong. It can never be justified, whether in the furtherance or defence of a political objective. And also, their perspective on the issue of forgiveness was also stood up. Because forgiveness without someone acknowledging the wrong that they have committed, without them owning and accounting and repenting of all of that, has no base. And the circumstances of Rwanda prove when the people of that nation, the perpetrators and others, were humbled, through God's grace, they were able to properly come back together again with those that they had wronged. The message to Northern Ireland is our stinking pride, our insistency to lie about the unjustifiable, means that this place is still in a position of standoff as opposed to peace. And Rwanda is a nation that needs to be examined more closely when we study so-called conflict resolution. We need to stop looking at European examples, or indeed touching on the South African experience as being the panacea of all things. Rwanda, a country where this place, disparagingly described sometimes as third world, describes it as a developing world country. In fact, we had the insult of that nation to say that it was somehow going to be a punishment for illegal immigrants coming to this nation to be put on planes and sent to Africa. Let me say this, that Rwanda and the people of that place have nothing, but spiritually they have everything. And we in the Western world have everything materialistically. How rich are we spiritually?
Obviously, my name's Sammy Heenan. I was brought up in the rural townland of Leganani, and at 12 years old, the provisional IRA came into my home, forced my father to his knees out in our yard, and shot him twice in the top of the head at point blank range. And as a 12-year-old boy, I came out and found his body that morning, an image that I will never ever forget. 3 years before that, I lost my mother to natural causes, and 4 months before that I was with my grandmother. She died in the chair sitting beside me. So it was a very, very traumatic upbringing. As a consequence, I lost my home, but my church here in Ballyward were exceptionally good to me in terms of a pastoral sense, in particular the Reverend Robert Jones, who there was so much community support for me at that particular time. And when I got the opportunity to go out to Rwanda, I suppose I was representing this church and the Elim Church in North Ireland, and many people from the faith-based community, when we do have questions around forgiveness, repentance, reconciliations. There are a lot of subjects there that we felt we could maybe tease out of how Rwanda progressed on that basis.
My name is Kitty Heenan, and Sammy is my father, and I lost my grandfather on the 3rd of May 1985 to the Provisional IRA. I think for me, I feel very privileged. Being asked to accompany the others on this trip was a great privilege for me, because I was allowed to share my thoughts and my ideas of our community and the concept of reconciliation from a young person's perspective, which I feel very privileged I was able to take to Rwanda with me.
Well, for me, I suppose what we suffered in Northern Ireland was horrendous as a people, as two communities. And I suppose sometimes when you're here, you're quite insular. in your thinking. But when we went out to Rwanda, we always obviously knew about the genocide. But sometimes when there's other areas, war-torn areas, they're far away. It's only when we went out to Rwanda did we truly understand the loss, the evil that was perpetrated against innocent people, where there was 1 million people murdered in 100 days, and to hear their accounts, their experiences, was really no different to ours. Their pain, their loss, their every emotion they experienced was the same as ours in Northern Ireland. So it was good to connect up with victims and survivors, and to hear the responses of even perpetrators, repentant perpetrators, people who had demonstrated true remorse for the evils they committed against their neighbours and fellow country folk. So for us, it was a steep learning curve, very emotional to hear all those accounts, and we certainly learned from it, and it broadened our horizons and experiences and related to what we had encountered ourselves in Northern Ireland.
I think for me specifically, because I am only 21 years old, I am obviously a generation removed from the Troubles. It is a long-lasting impact, even though I can say very happily that I didn't live through the trauma. The trauma still carries through generations. Obviously, I lost my grandfather and I lost that relationship with him. However, as a young person, the concept of reconciliation is very different in Northern Ireland, and that was only reinforced to me when I went to Rwanda, because I did see, whenever I was engaging with young people and young children over there, the concept of reconciliation and understanding what's right and wrong is drilled into children from a very young age, that what happened in Rwanda was not okay under any circumstances. However, in my opinion, in Northern Ireland, this idea of revisionism is very stark. Young children, young people my age, have very different ideas of what happened in Northern Ireland, and some would even argue that what happened was okay under certain circumstances. But obviously going to Rwanda, it reinforced what all of us knew together, that what happened not only in Rwanda but in Northern Ireland during the Troubles was not okay under any circumstance.
Well, obviously, for victims in Northern Ireland now, at this moment in time, I think justice is lost for most of us. But the one thing, as Katie has already alluded to, is the revisionism of our history. And that's something we as innocent victims have to robustly challenge going forward. We're not wanting to be stuck in the past. We need to progress, we need to move on, but we need to move on on a pathway of equality between our communities. And what I'm seeing in Northern Ireland is now young people growing up believing, as Katie has already said, that there was, there was justification for the murder of innocent people, that, like particularly the IRA, or a legitimate army who were fighting oppression and defending their community, but nothing justified the taking of 3,700 lives, over 42,000 people injured, and unbelievable damage to community relations and to the fabric of our community. So when we went out to Rwanda, it was fascinating to see the work that's going on now between victims and perpetrators, but repentant perpetrators. That's very much the difference. And obviously the Cow for Peace initiative brought that very much to the fore. But in Rwanda, anybody we witnessed, there was genuine remorse for the actions that they committed against their neighbour. To witness the school where young people, the militia, come across from a neighbouring country, and they're going to murder the young people, but they asked the young people who were Hutu and who were Tutsi. And the young people would not declare what background they were from, because in their mindset, which was just such a healing mindset, a progressive mindset, that we are all Rwandans, and we're not going to be divided on the basis of our background or ethnicity. And unfortunately, many young people lost their lives as a consequence of their unity to move on as a young people united together.
I think for me, probably the church service on the Sunday and the worshiping aspect was one of my favourite parts of the trip, especially because I got to interact with so many young people who belong to the church. For me, it was definitely one of those once-in-a-lifetime experiences. The kids were obviously very fun to interact with me. They loved touching my hair. They just loved holding you in some way or interacting with you in some way, which was just a very special moment for me, to see these kids be so eager to talk to somebody who they'd never met before and have so much joy towards you. for the entire trip of Rwanda, it gave me time to reflect on my own spiritual journey. It gave me time to sit down and reflect on my own path in a way that I was maybe not allowed to do at home or never let myself have the time to do. So I think that is one aspect of why Rwanda was so special for me, not only reflecting on my own journey, but seeing the kids' journeys with faith and the other Rwandans was very special to me and allowed me to have self-reflection.
My name's Paul Toombs. I'm 60 years of age, and I grew up in the seaside town of Warren Point, where we went to church, Sunday school, and we played with our friends. We were a normal family. The only thing different about us that our dad was in the Customs and Excise, and he was also a member of the Ulster Defence Regiment. And life was slightly different there because of living in a fairly Republican stroke nationalist area. That we had to, safeguards were put in place for the family. Dad had to look underneath his car in the mornings going to work. We had to ask and inquire who was knocking our door in the hours of darkness. And that's simply how we lived. And then in 1976, the 3rd of August, Dad was attacked and seriously wounded on the Dublin Road in Newry. He survived that gun attack and went on to recover and back to his job, full-time job with the Customs and as Major in C Company 3 UDR in Rwanda. It was 16th of January 1981 that when we were at school, I'm the eldest of 5 children, the youngest being 3. I remember getting the call to go to the headmaster's office where my grandfather and my brother and 2 of my sisters, where the third one, Catherine, was at home being looked after by my grandmother because Mum was seriously ill in hospital at the time. And in fact, some of the family thought that it was Mum who had something had seriously gone wrong. But unfortunately, it wasn't until we got home that we were told that Dad had been killed earlier on that day. The reports that were told to us that 2 gunmen had arrived in the docks in Warren Point on a motorcycle. They entered the office. One gunman covered the other, and the other gunman went into his office, but his gun jammed. Apparently Dad struggled with the gunman, and on the other gunman was called into the room to help, and Dad was shot, and the other gunman calmly cleared his weapon and put further rounds into his body and into his head. Today we're standing in Mount Norris Presbyterian Church, of which I'm a member of and a leading elder within the church. And it was a great privilege to represent our church out in Rwanda, and for the generosity of our church family here in Mount Norris and Tullyallen. One of the main things that we wanted to learn when we went out to Rwanda, we not only met with church leaders, politicians, but also to meet with the victims of families in the villages and get a sense of their feelings and to understand what caused the conflict, how they have moved forward in terms of reconciliation, and what the government there has done to try and bring 2 ethnic groups together in terms of justice, in terms of reconciliation, and also the responsibility that's carried to those who perpetrated such evil. And one of the things that really struck me when we were out at Rwanda, that there was a clear sense of justice, and to recognise that moving forward, You need to build relationships. You need to build that trust back into the community again, that everybody can live in harmony. One of the most striking and one of the points that I really remembered was a visit to Nyamata, which is a memorial site out in the country area of Rwanda, where 5,000 people were taken into a church where they were seeking sanctuary and safety. And unfortunately, they were locked in and all were massacred. And just to see the bullet holes in the walls, and they have set out on the benches all the clothing of all the people that were inside. And as I walked round slowly, I seen a small child's white dress, no more than 3 years of age, covered in dried blood. And I just thought of the enormity of this and how those families felt at that particular time. And I thought to myself, the same thing could have happened in Northern Ireland, but for the sacrifice and service of those in the security forces, like the RUC or UDR. We've had our different types of violence here. We've had things like the Shanker Road butchers. We have mass murder. But in this case, it was 5,000 people in one building were killed. The enormity of it really struck me, and I really, when we retired later on, that sense of just being there really struck me. And there was a shaft of light came in through the window when we were there. And I just thought to myself, you know, even in the darkest of places and what happened here, the light of God still shines in those dark places and still brings comfort to those who have grieved. And it's through our belief in the Lord Jesus Christ that gives us that faith and gives us that strength to carry on even through the midst of terrible, terrible atrocities. There is still people who organised and who were the main instigators and leaders of the genocide are still wanted and still sought by the judicial system in Rwanda, even though they may have fled to different countries. So that sense of justice in somewhere like Rwanda was very, came across to us as something that we really haven't got in Northern Ireland here. I was very glad that when I mentioned it to our elders within Mount Norris and Tullyalban Presbyterian Church, that I was going to Rwanda, and part of the reason we were going out there was to take something tangible with us as well, not just to hear the stories and find out more what happened in Rwanda, but leave something there that was tangible. And we raised money for what is termed a cow for peace. And this is a cow that is presented to the victim of one of the perpetrators. And in turn, when that cow has a calf, it is then given to the perpetrator. Both have a responsibility to look after the cow, feed it and shelter it. And this brings this type of reconciliation because both need each other and both depend on each other. But this is some tangible way where they can work together and focus on something that they need, both in that community. And we raised the money, and I was the privilege of going along to the presentation of that cow and the rest of the animals that were we had got monies for. At that ceremony, the whole village had come out, and I have to sort of say, the people who received it, the joy that was in there and the smiles on their face really said it all for us. I don't believe there are as many hugs and kisses anytime than what I did there, because I could sort of see we in the West have a lot of material aspects, and we are very blessed to have the homes and everything else that we have in our lives, material aspects. Out there, they haven't the same material things to have. And really, it's the simple things in life that are the most important. And it's that love and it's that generosity of character that we really seen in the faces of not only the young people, but on the older generation as well. That people like ourselves had a concern and were out there to share our story as well as them tell us their story. Diane Holt was the person from over here who facilitated us. And, you know, what really impacted ourselves was not only the what we seen and what we heard. We went to churches, we went out to the villages, and to hear actually the villagers talk about what had actually happened, and to see a lady there who had lost her whole family, and the perpetrator of that family there as well. And some of those conversations, we started to speak about our own situation here in Northern Ireland. And for them, that was the first time in a lot of cases where they've had a lot of Americans, Australians, and people from other academic spheres throughout the world over to ask them about the genocide. But on this occasion, they were talking to victims from the troubles here in Northern Ireland. And we sensed their pain and they sensed our pain. And I remember Yvonne was sitting there very quietly, and another lady was sitting over in the corner from Rwanda. And Yvonne had lost her husband, and she also had lost her husband. And after that meeting, just both ladies got up and embraced each other in tears. And that for me said it all. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. Your pain was the same as our pain. And those things that had happened. And really, that workshop opened up a lot of emotion for both Rwandans and for people from Northern Ireland like ourselves. So we were able to reflect in the evening times of what we had actually seen. And we went back to have a word with each other. We prayed at times and we read scripture together. And it was through those times that, you know, a lot of emotions came out, and we opened up to each other because we hadn't done that with other people. And we found that speaking to one another helped each other because each person was connected through their loss, which was very, very, very difficult at times. It was wrong. It's wrong in the eyes of the law, and it's wrong in the eyes of God. And we must be, you know, it can't be a matter of just words. It has to be a meaning and a changing of ways here in Northern Ireland. And I just pray and hope that those people will reflect on what they've done. And I pray that God in some way will soften their hearts, and they too might come to a saving faith in Jesus Christ and see that their ways were wrong, and there's a much, much more peace in their lives with God at the center of everything. And that's my prayer for this nation and for further afield.
My name's Alan Irwin, originally from 6 Mile Cross. My father and uncle were both murdered by the Provisional IRA. My uncle in 1979 and my father in 1986. And I suppose I was one of those late comers into ministry when I went into ministry. And I came here to Colony, for I felt this is where God was leading me to. And I came here in 2012, and I've been here since, and discovered when I came here that actually this parish had lost a member of its congregation through terrorism as well. So a very outward-looking parish, a parish that, that is very much holds to the gospel teaching, so it's been a great blessing to be here, Thinking back to that initial conversation that we had about Rwanda, and I suppose I hadn't really given it much thought at the time, and I was just thinking back then that a lot of the genocide we would have watched on our television screens, at least I would have been mindful of it, and I think the reality of what was happening there, I think, drew me to go. And I suppose I wouldn't have. I'm not one for going out foreign or going out on any of these things, and I think it's just the fact that the group that was going and who was going with that probably made it more appealing and more awareness just to learn and to understand it. And I think that's probably the reason why I would have went on that score. It just, it wouldn't have been on any other, going out like that wouldn't be part of who I am. But just this time it was the fact that we discussed, and we were very much looking at forgiveness and repentance and all of those things that Rwanda then seemed to have an appeal to it, or lessons to be learned, I suppose in some sense, forgiveness was one of those things that was discussed. It's almost as if you had to forgive in relation to moving on and to building relationships and being reconciled. And it wasn't until we were up in that group, up in the cell group, up in the hills, that the reality was that's the thing that hit home when they discovered who we were and our circumstances and our losses, and compared, they could relate to us better than these academics who come just to see what's happening. And the realization was then, when the question was very much asked about forgiveness and repentance, was very clearly put: if there's no repentance, there's no forgiveness. And when you have that discussion with individuals in the midst of all of that, particularly that one-on-one, you almost get the feeling that they've been told to forgive and they have forgiven. And when you, Brenda, speak directly and you speak about forgiveness from a biblical perspective, from where you would want it, you can see the pain and the hurt in their eyes, that for many of them, and you can see it welling up, that maybe they've done something without the real sense of knowing what forgiveness actually was. And I think that's the thing that surprised me in some ways, is they've done something in order to have a semblance of normality back in their country. I think it would have to be through that, their cry for peace. There is a sense of making restitution for the hurts through the cry for peace, and bringing about that form of reconciliation. And that can only happen if the individuals have acknowledged what they've done was wrong, and they've sought repentance. And there is a sense too, when I think about that as well, that when you accept that, you accept that you've been a guilty party in this, that you have done hurt. So there's an acknowledgement of saying, yes, I have done wrong, I'm willing to accept it, I'm willing to make restitution. So there's a sense where reconciliation or conciliation can then begin again in a more meaningful way than the threat that we have pushed against us here, that somehow you have to have it here, when it's not reconciliation, because first you've got to build the relationships. The key one had to be the church or the chapel that we went to, that all the clothes was laid out on the seats. I think that has to be the one that really impacts the most, in the sense that this is the stark reality of what happened. This is what really happened, and this is what, it's almost and I think that drives it home. It's maybe, if you want to draw a comparison, maybe of standing in Tynecott Cemetery with all the headstones, and you're looking at that, and somebody touches you in the shoulder, say, look, just think that every headstone's an individual, and some maybe two individuals. When you looked across those seats and all that clothing sitting there, every wee bundle was an individual, if not two individuals. And I think that's they show that as the act. This is what happened. They didn't try to bury it or hide it, and they told how it happened and what and the difficulties they experienced because of it, and even some of those who were guides, you know, who would have been very much a part in there at that time, you know. When I suppose going out on the plane, when the confirmation of that I would be speaking, and it doesn't matter whether I'd been in Rwanda or here, I'd still would get up with that degree of apprehension, because what I'm sharing, you know, has to be right, you know, and if it's not right, but in that experience, and really from those that were there, because I had to turn up with shirt and tie and dressed up, because I was the pastor in a sense who was there to speak, you know, then you were treated with a different air of reverence, and I think that sort of would take you back a little, but at the same time, there was a willingness to want to be in worship. People were there to worship, and we really just enjoyed the worship. The experience of standing up to speak, knowing that you could only say a few lines and have that translated so that they could understand, I think that took a little bit of getting to grips with, but just to look at the congregation that were there, and you know, the wee church was filled to capacity, like there wasn't one left, and they were as attentive as you could ask for, like, and that I think really struck me, and my few minutes at the start of a few words of Rwanda, you know, really set the scene, I think. But it was a blessing, and you know, one, I suppose I'm glad that I didn't refuse, that I took, and as you know, I used the setting up of the stones as memorials, and I spoke on that because that's what we'd been doing. So it related my address that related to them more so. So it's, for me, it's understanding who you're speaking with, you know. So it was, and even coming back and even sharing some of that here, you know, it's just the realization that they have very little, and yet they were sharing so much with us, even after the service. The unexpectedness of being taken in for a meal afterwards, and what really struck me was that they had the basin in the corner with the jug and the soap to wash our hands. And that was a really humbling moment, you know, when we went from that into the wee place and couldn't give us enough to eat, you know, and that was the blessing. And I think when you come back and see that we have so much, and the reality is we've nothing, you know, we really have nothing. We'd taken local councils and local areas, you know, football kits and hats from the local priest partnership, you know, the willy hats and all of those things out. Our cases was more bulging with stuff that we took out, but just we went to that wee football team up there, and they were just so overjoyed. Like, they were just, no sooner had you set the kits on the ground that they had them on and the hats on their head, like, and they were just so overjoyed with it. And at the time, and then I just remember we had sweets and we were sharing them out, and we had opened the bags so everybody would get a sweet, like, and there was none of somebody pushing in to grab more. Everybody was brought forward if anybody didn't, but just the joy on those people's faces, and some of the photographs that we take, just, you know, to have something that was bright and shiny and new, and everything was the same. You know, the team had a full kit. They weren't all wearing different things, you know, so you could just see the joy of getting something like that. And I think the joy of them receiving, but I think the joy of us in giving, that we were passing on something else from someone who gave to us in order to give out. I think that's the big connection there, and those who donated those things and gave those things, you know, we're deeply appreciative, very appreciative of what they've done, and some maybe not even having to be asked, just, here, I'll give you these. The biggest take I would take away from it is the fact that they don't bury the truth. Where we bury the truth, or we take a blind eye to the truth, or we ignore the truth, and we try to promote a different narrative here, or we allow it, you know, or, well, not us, the politics and maybe the church and maybe others, the media would allow to promote a different narrative because it supposedly keeps the supposed peace deal going. But the fact that they don't bury the truth, and they teach the next generation through education, and the importance that they learn their history, they understand the history. You know, even when we visited that school, and the reality of those children prepared to stand up and say that they were neither, they were Rwandans, and lost their lives, some of them as a result of that. It's the reality that, and I think that's the key thing, you can't bury the truth. The truth eventually will be known and known fully. When we went to the National Memorial Museum in Kilgally, we had made arrangements with Christoph to get a wreath so we could take a wreath out. And we'd asked at the reception, would it be okay for us to do that? And they said we could. So when we went round to the mass graves where we were to lay the wreath, there was already a wreath there on a stand, and that had already been laid by the American consul or visitor who had been there previously. And the guy just lifted it off and set it down on the ground on top of the thing to allow us to lay our wreath very much on the stand, which was a great thing, to be able to do that. But it was good. It was good because we did have our prayers and all of that. We didn't just lay the wreath and just stand back and make a polite bow.
My name's Yvonne Black. I am originally from Mahara. I grew up in a family of, I had four siblings. I met my husband when I was 17 and a half, and we got married when I was 23. I'm a nurse. I worked in Oma and then in Altnagelvin. I met David when I was 17 and a half, and we got married and we settled here in Cookstown. We have two children, Kyle and Kyra, and we attended this church. This is Molesworth Presbyterian Church. This was David's church, and we worshipped here every Sunday. Obviously, David and myself initially, and then as a family, we always felt it was really important to bring our children up within the church. They came through Sunday school and church, came to church every week. But at that stage, I wasn't, or neither David nor I were Christians at that stage. And it wasn't until after David was actually killed that I became a Christian. I suppose, do you know that obviously the day that David was murdered, 1st of November 2012, do you know that morning just started out as a completely normal morning. We were a family. We got up. David was working. I was working. Kyle was working in Belfast. He was in his year out of university. Kyra was at home. She had been out the night before. It was Halloween. And it was just a normal Thursday morning. And we all left. And David rang me about 7:15 to ask me something. And it literally was a 30-second phone call. And little did I know that I would never hear his voice again. And as I say, I went into work. I was working as palliative care nurse in Altnagelvin at the time. And I had gone to see, I say that was the 1st of November. My daddy had been killed in a farm accident on the 14th of November in 2011. So it was coming up to daddy's anniversary. And I really wasn't in very good form that morning because I thought it's only a few days now to my daddy's first anniversary. And it was bringing up a lot of feelings around that. So I'd gone into work and I'd gone to see a patient, and I was with a patient whenever my pager went off. And when I went to answer it, it was Kyle. Basically, Kyle said to me, "Mummy, have you been talking to Daddy today?" And I was like, "Yeah, I was earlier." And he was like, I said, "Why?" And he said, I said, "I've heard something on the news that there's been a prison officer killed on the motorway." And honestly, I can only say I would always be kind of going, "Oh my goodness." But I said, "No, Kyle, this isn't your daddy. This definitely is not your daddy." So I went back to the office, and one of my colleagues was there. And by the time I got back to the office, my heart was flying because I have to say, I was frightened. I was scared. I was hoping everyone was going to be okay, but I was scared. And I got back into the office, and so I had a number obviously in the prison whenever David was in the prison, they were not allowed mobiles or anything. So I had a number that I could ring him where he was working, but I couldn't ring it. So my colleague rang it for me, and I could hear her saying what had happened, and I wanted to speak to David. And I could see her taking her pen out and writing down a Belfast number. And at that second, I just knew there was something wrong. And literally she was just starting to ring the number when the door opened of our office, and then came a policeman and a policewoman. They were in their own clothes, but I knew who they were. And when they told me what had happened, initially they said it was an accident, and then they told me what had happened. And I suppose I look back at that. I relive that second by second. It is news that I never, ever, ever thought I was going to hear, because of what was said earlier, because we were in peace. But it was just absolutely devastating. All I could think of, what, with my children. I knew Kyle was in Belfast waiting for me to ring him back. I knew Kyra was at home on her own. And it was just sheer devastation and sheer panic on how we were going to manage this and how we were going to deal with this. And I suppose over the next few days, it was just unreal. Emotions, and on the other side of that, the love of people. I mean, just the amount of people that sent text cards, came to the house from all denominations. It wasn't, at the end of the day, I have very good Catholic friends, and they came to. I mean, it was just been unreal. But I suppose I explained it a wee bit like dropping a vase on the ground. You break a vase on the ground and it smashes into a million pieces, and you have to pick every one of them up and stick it back together to make that vase again. But it's completely deformed, and that's the way I look at my life. I've tried to stick it back together as best I can, but it'll never be the same, and it's completely wrecked our family from a point of view that we all grieved in separate ways. And, it's just been horrendous. It's like something takes away your life now and your future, and everything you do, there's this huge gap in it. I suppose we're talking about Rwanda, and I'll never forget the first night that Kenny rang me about potentially what was going to happen with Rwanda. And when I took that phone call, I sat in awe. And the reason why I sat in awe was the fact that during my time as a young Christian, even now, a lot of times I couldn't read my Bible, I couldn't pray, but I could always listen to music. And I listened to UCB, either 1 or 2 on the radio, going back and forward. Anytime in the car, I still do, but particularly going to work. And there's so many times God has spoken to me through song. Anybody listens to UCB one, there's a song, but there's also people will talk about different things. And I remember driving, I was actually driving home from work, anyway, this man came on to talk about the Cow for Peace. And he was talking about that and about Rwanda. And I remember turning it up and listening to it and going, oh my goodness, like that is unreal. But I didn't really think anything more about it. And I think it was about 3 days later when Kenny rang and said, we're thinking about going to Rwanda, and started to talk about the Cow for Peace. And I knew instantly that this was something God wanted me to do. And that he had already opened that door for me. And I have never heard it mentioned since. I've never heard it talked about anywhere, apart from obviously what we've been involved with. But I just felt it was God was opening that door for me, so that I knew very clearly that was something that he wanted me to do. So when that door opened, I suppose I didn't really think very much about it, of what the reality of it was going to be like. I just felt this was something God wanted me to do, so I said yes. But in saying that, when we arrived in Rwanda and the reality of it all started to unfurl, I can only say it was an absolutely emotional roller coaster. going there. And I think going there with the people that I went with as well, that we all had the similar experience of losing people that we love to terrorism in Northern Ireland, and to go and to see what happened in the genocide in Rwanda was just unbelievably emotional. But I think, I suppose, one of the biggest things for me was when we went out into the countryside and we met the group of the victims and survivors. And I went very skeptical because I didn't know what to expect, but at the same time I went very, it was really emotional. And to sit in that room and to hear the conversations that we had and all of that, it was just so, what's the word I'm looking for? The humility in that room was beyond anything that I have ever. There was no politics, there was no nothing. There was just an absolute real conversations around what had happened, and nobody tried to justify what they did. They realised what they did, and the hurt and the pain that was felt by the victims, and the recognition by the perpetrators that what they did was wrong, with no justification, nothing, was so, as I say, that just the humility of it all was just unreal. And to see that, how they were able to work through all of that, even with their anger from the victims, the perpetrators were able to understand that and actually acknowledge it, and how that was working to be able to bring them together, and to see that big umbrella of peacemaking was just unreal. I suppose one of the big things, as I said there, was us being there as a group of people, and obviously being a group of people who had similar experiences of losing people that we love to terrorism, but being a group of people who all were Christians, who all have that personal relationship with God, was such a blessing, because in all of that we had time every day to spend around God's word. That we did a Bible study, and we had reflections. Every day, as I said, that was so emotional, and it brought up lots of emotions for all of us. I remember one personal kind of thing that happened there. There was a lady who sat over in the corner from over to the left of me when we were sitting, and she got up and spoke about her husband who was killed. And I remember her looking at me and me looking at her, and there was that instant, just that connection was just, it went way beyond that room, and I didn't really understand. She was talking her language, Christoph was interpreting, but there was that instant connection. And I remember later on her coming over and hugging and talking, but we didn't understand each other. But you know what, our hearts spoke, and there was just that connection. And I think, knowing that that we knew each other's pain. I think that's what the connection was. For all that was right there, I look here and see it's a completely opposite, because there's no accountability from the top in regards to what is wrong. We're constantly rewriting history, we're constantly trying to justify what has been happening in this country. And as far as I'm concerned, nothing can justify a life. Whether that is, nothing can justify taking any life, regardless of religion, colour, anything else. A life is a life. God gives us that. It's sacred, and nobody can take it. And sometimes I think to myself, how can the people, and I can only personalise it to me and my family, is sometimes I kind of think of the people who sat down and planned David's murder. And how can they live with it? How can they live with themselves? How could they go on after that happened that day? How did they go and have breakfast? How did they have lunch? How did they just have a normal life? And yet people would justify that. And people would take that justification and actually listen to it. And for me, that's what I see in Northern Ireland, is that accountability comes from the top down, and that just does not happen here. So for me, we need to look at what has happened, and we need to look at how we deal with this, and we need to look at attitudes, and we need to look at, what accountability that each and every one of us, yes, government down, but each and every one of us in society have something to learn from this. Because when you looked in Rwanda, it wasn't just the victims and the perpetrators, it was the whole community came round to support them. And as much as that happens, here, there's no accountability, there's no justice, there's none of those things. And for me and my family, for my children, and I just look and think, oh, this has all happened for what? For absolutely nothing. It's just destroyed our lives. It's taken David's life. For what?
We're now in a very special place, and that's the grounds of Holy Trinity Church of Ireland, Lisnaskea, where this memorial remembers the innocence of terrorism across the district electoral area of South East Fermanagh. And these names represent much more than simply the families to which these loved ones belonged. They represent a story of ethnic cleansing along our border. A story which is not told either locally or indeed internationally. And the people of this area have demonstrated an incredible resilience, an incredible dignity, and also an incredible restraint over the years in never wanting to bring to their neighbour's door that which was brought to theirs. In the background, we can also see that beautiful church of Holy Trinity Church of Ireland and its connectivity in this project with Rwanda, because we were all representing particular churches, those of us, the 6 of us who went out and had that exchange and visit. And another point on that Rwandan visit, which will always live in our memory, is that we were able to praise God with the Rwandan people one Sunday, when none other than our own Canon Reverend Alan Irwin led worship. He began proceedings by using the dialect of that country, to the surprise and to the satisfaction, I can say, of those who were present. It was a special moment. The way in which those Rwandans and Africans praised God, a purity in it, a joy. They were rejoicing at being together. The colours of the dresses and the clothing that they wore. These people have nothing. Yet they had that one Sunday outfit, which they obviously hold precious and wore on that particular Sunday. So Christianity, this place of Northern Ireland, indeed wider Ireland. My granny once said the following words: Ireland is full of denominational religion, north and south. But how much Christianity is there? That's a question we really should ask ourselves, including those involved with the churches.